All right, so as we go on to the next step in our development process here, we're really going to address some of the shortcomings. I mean, it's amazing, really, when you think about what the scaffolding does in MVC, what a polished and finished user interface it builds for us based on the work we've done in the back end so far. But it's not perfect, right? We have to help it along, and there are definitely some issues that we talked about there in the UI design that we're going to address next. So I hope you took time to watch the last video I just put up between part one and or step one and step two here on link, because we're going to be relying for some of the work we do here on using link expressions. So I hope that that review is helpful to you. Okay, just pick up where we left off then in our demo. So remember, this the last thing we did is we added the ability here to ensure the database is deleted and recreated every time you restart the application. Maybe overkill. I mean, sometimes that's what we want to happen, but you know what? If I'm messing around and creating a record and then going back out and back in, I don't want to have to recreate it every time. So I'm going to comment out that first line for now. I don't want to delete the database every time I start. I can leave the ensure created. That's not going to hurt because it just makes, as long as the database is there, it just skips over that. But it does guarantee that I have the database ready to go. So that's not such a bad thing. So I'm going to leave it that way. I'm going to save that and close this for now, right? Remember, we were calling that whole thing from our call to seed the data right here. I'll leave that in place. By the way, eventually you might comment this out as well. Like if you don't really need to seed data over and over again, then you have that option. You could just comment it out and then put it back in place by removing the comments if you need it. All right, let me run it once more. I'm going to switch back to this web server, the Kestrel web server, just to save a bit of time. So their little DOS window opens up here for the Kestrel, right? You can look at it if you want. It's really not a big deal. Okay, so I have a secured connection here, right? Doctors is pretty simple and straightforward. There's not too much I'm going to worry about changing here. Most of the issues we identified so far were here on the patients, right? First thing I think we actually noticed was that our drop-down list here for doctors for the foreign key is only showing the first name, right? Only showing the first name, and you can see that they aren't in any particular order as well, right? Now, see, I added one record here that wasn't part of the seed data, but it's been left in place because they didn't drop the database, okay? And if after noticing that, come back to the index here, you see the same thing is shown here under doctor. We're just showing the first name of the doctor. Well, that's not very professional. Other issues? Well, for one thing, there's just so many darn columns, right? First, middle, last name, that takes up a lot of space on the screen just for those three things. We could probably concatenate that together, right? We've done that in the past in other courses, put the name together even though we've broken it apart for storage reasons, and it'll take up a lot less space. Something else to think about, well, what about the OHIP number? That's pretty confidential information, and in many cases, the date of birth is pretty confidential as well. So maybe we don't want, that might be an example of information we don't want on the screen all the time. Plus, we made mention of the fact that down the road, when we start adding authentication and authorization, authentication says we know who is logged in, authorization is what they can do. So maybe we might have some employees that can come to the index view, but they really shouldn't be privy to private information such as the OHIP number and even maybe the date of birth, for example, right? And other people would have to have that. Well, if we leave that on the details page and protect it so only certain people can see all the details about a patient, right? Then the index page could be used by everybody in the office who just maybe needs to grab the name and find the phone number to call them up and remind them about appointment or whatever, right? Okay, so that's an example of, the kind of motivation why we might want to change the amount of data and specifically what data is shown here on the index, plus even the format, right? This phone number format, yeah, we said it's a phone number, but there's some limitations here. It doesn't automatically format it for us because there's, well, let's face it, internationally, there's all different ways to format a phone number, so we can't expect the system to know that for us, right? So those are some of the issues we're going to address next. All right, so I'm just going to stop running, close that for now. So let's start in our model classes, because believe it or not, much of the work that we need to do, we can actually do right here by using additional properties, right? Now, these properties so far are all ones that get stored in the database. We can have read-only properties, so sometimes we call them summary properties, right? And the great thing about them is that we don't actually have to store them in the data. Actually, they don't get stored in the database, so it doesn't require any migrations or changes to the database at all, right? Just as we get the data, we can kind of combine things together in the most convenient way to display it in the UI. So here's a couple that I'll often use when you have names like this, right? Full name, okay, is a nice way to put together first name, the middle initial, and the last name as one concatenated piece of information. I'm going to give it the display name patient because I think that works well on the screen. It just says patient and it shows the name of the patient, right? Now notice that we are using an expression here to check, if the middle name is null, then we're just going to put a space between the first name and the last name. If it's not null, okay, we're taking advantage that a string is just basically a character array, right? So we pull the first character out and then we uppercase it, okay, combining it with a space in front and a period space afterwards. That gives us a nice way to put together the full name. You could write this expression in a number of other ways. Feel free, as long as it works, that is perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. Another one is age, right? Now we did this kind of a code, those that had me last term as well. When we want to hide the specific details of the date of birth, okay, for security reasons, right? Identity theft and all that kind of thing. But, maybe in the medical office, it is handy to have a quick reference to the age of the patient. So remember that our date of birth is actually a nullable date time. So we have to do extra steps here, right? To use the Elvis operator. You've talked about the Elvis operator before, I think. I just highlighted it in blue there. Let me just put a bit of space around it here so you can see it more clearly, right? Why do we call it the Elvis operator? Well, the two dots look like Elvis's eyes, and then the question mark looks like that little curl of hair on his forehead. Honestly, I didn't make that up. One of the presenters at Microsoft did. Anyway, all right, so of course that what allows us to do is to access properties of an object that might be null, right? So anyway, you might remember this from our discussion last term that, to calculate age, one of the most reliable ways is just subtract the difference in the year, right? The current year from the date of birth year. But then you have to check, have you passed the birthday in the current year, right? If you're past it, you have to add 1 to that difference in years, right? Otherwise, you just leave it as it is and you don't add, you add 0, right? So that's what all this code is. We're just checking, hey, are we past the birth month? Oh, and if we're in the birth month, have we passed the birthday, right? And that is all a decision simply coming down to, are we going to add 1 or not, right? And that gives us a reliable way, irregardless of leap years or anything else, to calculate the age, right? So there's 2 summary properties we're going to add here. Another one that's probably useful in this case, and I'll have to be honest, if we were still using a numeric format for the phone number, right, as we could get away with SQL Server, because it can handle a nice large integer, then we would just use a string format command. But here, we're storing the phone number as a string, so I need to do some string manipulation, right? There's more other ways to write this as well, but basically I'm putting a bracket, the first 3 digits of the phone number, bracket space, the next 3 digits of the phone number, dash, and the final ones, right? And that's all there is to it. So there's my formatted phone numbers. Those are the 3 properties I'm going to add for now to our patient, and I can use them for displaying the information on the screen. For the doctor, okay, I'm going to add 2 properties here, both working with the name. Right? There's our same full name expression. I'm giving it the display name doctor. But I'm also throwing in a formal name. Formal name is a term often used to refer to when you have last name first and then first name last. Well, of course, we're going to throw on the middle initial at the very end here as well, right? So formal name is good. It's very useful in particular for drop-down lists and selects of different sorts, right? Because we can sort it alphabetically in the correct order so that, all the last names are the first thing. You start typing a letter and it jumps to the last name. And it's a very comfortable way to present information to the end user, right? So those summary properties can all be added without any need for a new migration or any changes to the database. Okay, good. Now, how can we use these as we build the actual views themselves? Well, let's come down to the views for patient, and maybe I'll start on the index view. Right? So what are we going to do here? Well, we talked about the fact that we want to totally remove the OHIP number. It doesn't need to be here. It's still going to be on the details page. And if people have authorization to see the details page, they can get it there. Separate columns for first, middle, and last. Well, it just wastes an awful lot of screen space. So I'm going to take out 2 of them. I could choose any one and change this to full name, right? There we go. Date of birth, I'll change to age. And the phone is fine. We're leaving the rest for now, right? That's fine. Coming down here, remember how this works, just a quick reminder. What we have is a model. This is a strongly typed view. That's the term used. Strongly typed, we give it an actual model that it works with. The model is a IEnumerable, a collection of patient objects, right? So the header row just accesses properties of the model in general and uses display name for, which finds any display names that have been set with data annotations. If there isn't one, it just uses the actual name of the property, right? Down in here, we have a for each loop in the body of the table where we create basically a table row for each item in the model. In other words, for each patient in this IEnumerable collection of patients, right? And as we go through, then we have display for, which is pretty smart. Okay, there's a little HTML helper as part of Razor code, right? It has these different methods, and display for is why we can have very nicely, for example, have the email. It automatically is smart enough to know that we're going to want a link, a mail to link for an email address, and so on and so forth, right? There are limits to it, right? It doesn't actually work with that phone number without us helping it out and things like that. But it's pretty darn good, okay, when it comes to a date of birth, right? It's good for that, formatting it, and so on, right? Okay, but here on the index page, again, we're getting rid of the OHIP number. That's gone. We're changing this column to use the full name. We're getting rid of middle and last. Remember, this is executed for each row. Changing this to the age. Now the phone, we're going to use the phone formatted summary property instead. And doctor, instead of the first name of the doctor, let me point this out. See, the item is the patient, because we're looping through all the items in the model. We have eagerly loaded the doctor as an object inside the patient, using that navigation property, the actual doctor object that's defined inside patient. And that gives us access to all of the properties. Well, guess what? We now have a full name property that we added as a summary property inside the doctor class. So we can use that right here. Excellent. So that's good. So we cut down the number of columns, remove things that we really want to hide, just showing the ages of the date of birth, etc. And then we're now using the full name of the doctor to make those similar changes here, some of them on the details page. Now, we don't want to hide anything. We want to leave all that. But the phone number, right, we want to use phone formatted. So that looks nicely formatted here. It's read-only anyway. And for the doctor, we want to use, again, the full name. All right. So that's it for those two. So let's just see how it looks now. Let's just run it again. I'm just using the Kestrel server. It gives us a little black window there. The command window is running in the background for the server. So now when I come to patients, that's much improved, right? We just have one column here for the name of the patient, right? The doctor is showing the full name of the doctor, right? We're just showing the age, how many years old they are, not showing the actual date of birth, and the phone number is nicely formatted. Same thing if I come to details. Yes, all the information is separately available here, which is good. Okay, that way we're seeing the full middle name as well, right? As opposed to just the initial, middle initial, right? And then down here we have the phone number formatted, and we're showing the full name of the doctor. All right, good improvement, but there's still more to be done, right? Remember, this is the first thing we notice is our drop-down list here for the doctor is only showing the first name, so we haven't addressed that issue just yet. Okay, so let me just, actually I might stop running for now. All right, so that involves doing some work in the controller, right? So I'm going to close these two, and I can close these as well. I'm done with those. All right, so let's come now to the actual, we'll start in the patient's controller. All right, let's just review a couple things we touched on before. You know, the scaffolding is great. You can see what on the index here, this is why we were able to pull the name information for the doctor is because in our link query, remember you just learned about link, okay, we go to context.patients and we're doing a dot include. So as it pulls each patient, it includes that doctor object, okay? Eagerly loads it in so we can access the name information for the doctor, right? Now, I always change this. It just comes up. It doesn't have anything else, so it comes up with the best name it can think of, usually something based on the context, right? The DB context name. But this really is a collection of patients, so I'm going to change the name there. Doesn't matter what it's called when we pass it to the view. It just has to be an IEnumerable collection of objects. Okay, all right. There we go. So that's the index. I'm going to skip over details for now. Let's come down here to the create. Okay. So we touched on this once before, but this select list is a special data structure designed specifically to give the information for, in a web page, a select or drop-down list, right? And it has a number of overloads, but basically this most commonly used one is we pass a IEnumerable collection of items, right? So that's a link query just going context.doctors, just goes in, give me all the doctors, right? Then we have our data value field and our data text field. So the internal value is the primary key, the ID, and the text field right now is first name. There's the culprit. That's why we're only seeing, okay, on the create and on the edit pages, we're only seeing the first names, right? So if I change that to formal name instead of full name, formal name I find works better for drop-down lists, which is why we added it to the doctor class, right? Because it's last name, then first name, then middle initial. So it sorts alphabetically very nicely if we do a sort, and that gives us a nice presentation of the formal name of the doctor, right? Now, of course, to sort it, okay, we aren't getting it sorted from the database. We'll have to do that here ourselves. So again, we're going to use some link to do that. Now, we could write this in a number of different ways, but the quickest and dirtiest way to get this done is I'm just going to continue, okay, the link expression. Now, you could do it, pick this up however you want. Sometimes we do it this way, dot doctors. Then I'm going to go dot. And then here are lots of the other options. Order by is one. Now, this requires a link query, right? Or a link expression, I should say. So D goes to D dot. And by the way, that letter D means nothing, right? I could have Fred there, the whole word Fred if I wanted instead of the letter D. But it is, since it's doctors, I figured D was a good name to use. So it gives me access to this particular property of the doctor, right? So I want to order it by. Now, here's one thing. I can't order by formal name. You'd think I should be able to, but I can't, because remember, this query is going to be converted into SQL and sent to the database. Well, remember, one of the great things about a summary property is it doesn't exist in the database, right? So that wouldn't work. It would just give me an error saying, hey, I can't find any field called formal name in the database. So we'll have to do it the long way, right? I will, first of all, order by last name. Now, if you haven't run into this with link queries before, we can add an order by clause, but you only get one, right? However, after the order by clause, we can add as many then by that we want. So my then by will be D goes to D dot first name. And I could carry on and do the middle name as well. But you know what? If doctors in my office have got the same first and last name, I'm not going to worry too much about it, having to sort them as well by the middle name, right? So that should be good enough for me. Okay, so that's good. So now when we run our application again on the create get, okay, this should be properly showing the data we want in the right order, showing the full, well, the formal name, right? So let me just get that up and running here. So going to patients, if we click create new, okay, there we go. And now we see the full name, sorry, I should be careful, the formal name, full name in formal name format, alphabetically sorted and perfect. We're good. This is exactly what we want. But you know what? That's not the only place where this code is going to be needed. For example, if I were to get an error and come back to this page, right? Well, that happened on the GET request for this page, but we haven't changed it on the POST request, right? And we haven't changed it on the EDIT page at all, right? So that brings us to this point. Let me come back here. Basically, that expression, we see it down here. This is the original one, right? Basically getting the same information. The difference between what we had the first time and this is this additional argument. Right? Another one of the overloads after the data value field, data text field, is selected value. See that right there? Object selected value. So we can pass that as an option to say, okay, we want to select one of the options in the drop-down list. And that makes sense if you're editing, for example, or even if you're back, okay, redisplaying the page after a failed create, and you're going to maybe show some feedback to the user about error messages and so on, then we want to make sure that we put this selection back to the one that they had made a minute ago, right? But it's basically the same link query with that one difference. So we find it here. Guess what? It's in both the edit, get, it's in the edit post, right? It's in five places in the overall controller, right? So whenever you see code repeated in 5 places when you're going to modify it, why not simplify things and put it into one method that you can just call from all 5 places? That way, if you ever need to make a change, you're good, right? You don't have to worry about it. So we're going to do that next. Sorry, when I say you're good, what I mean is that you can make changes in one place instead of having to find all the spots in your code where you're using basically the same expression. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new method down here. I usually, when I'm adding them, I'll come right to the bottom and do them right before this last final patient exists, right? So I'm going to make a populate drop-down lists, right? And this gives me a chance as well to explore another way of writing a link query. Okay? Remember back up here when we were fixing this one right here in the get create. Okay, this link query to pull the information from the doctor's collection, order by, then by, right? This was all done directly with link, okay, in expression syntax. Oops, sorry, bite my tongue. This is extension method syntax. That's what I meant to say, right? So I'm going to write it the second time using query expression syntax instead. So it's the same query, essentially, but written a different way. So here's my private, okay, is void, populate drop-down list, and we pass in a patient object, right? I'm setting it as a default value of null. That way I can use it if I want to pre-select an object in the list or not, right? So here I've broken the query out separately. So I'm saying from D in context doctors, order by, and this way I don't have to use that then by. I can say order by and D dot last name, D dot first name, right? And then we finally select D. So that is the query expression syntax, gets the same job done pretty much in the same way as extension method syntax. Now, I think I mentioned in my discussion before that in the end, this gets converted into extension method syntax before it actually gets executed, but that's okay. So that's our query, right? And then my view data doctor ID, that dictionary of name value pairs, the doctor ID is going to be my select list with the data coming from my query. Again, ID is the value, formal name is what's displayed. And here, because I passed in a patient object, which might be null, the Elvis operator lets me get away with that. I will pre-select whatever doctor I want to based on this patient object, right? There we go. So now that I have that in place, all I have to do is each of the plate spots here, right? Instead of having this code in place, I will just call my populate drop-down lists, right? Passing the patient. Now, the only time I don't pass the patient same thing here for the get will be that initial create, right? Okay, so here I don't have a patient to pass, so I just leave this empty, right? So that's it. So 5 spots, okay, and it's all fixed up. All right. Now my populate drop-down list will be properly used in all the situations where I actually need it. The last change we're going to make to harmonize with that is going to be back in the patient create view, right? Because when we edit, that's perfectly fine, right? They've already, the record's been created, so there must be a doctor assigned, so there's no change to make there. But when we're creating a brand new patient, right, the way we deal with this drop-down list needs to be a little bit different. Because what we want is to force them to choose, right? We don't want it just to take whatever doctor happens to be at the top of the list. If they don't change it, that's the one they get assigned. That's not a good design. No, we have to force the end user to actually make a choice and choose a doctor. How do we do that here on the create? Well, essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to add our own option in the HTML of the page, right? I'm going to set the oh my goodness. That's pretty clever here, although I don't like these dashes. That's something that the IntelliSense thing wanted to add, but I don't like them. Select a doctor. Oh, I took out the slash. Okay, so by adding that option, this will appear at the top of the list, and then all the data coming in the items collection here, coming from our view bag, right, will be added below in the order that they're stored in this collection, right? So that's perfect. The only thing is we want to guarantee that they actually pick something, right? Notice that on all the other inputs here, the system has scaffolded a span here for the validation error message, right? And we don't have one here because it didn't assume that we needed to do any validation. But now that I've given them an option, which is an invalid option, saying select a doctor, I need to actually add a span for that. So let me just steal the one from here, paste it in here, but of course, ASP validation for doctor ID. Okay, that class just makes it red, right? Or whatever your text danger is according to your CSS, it's usually red. Okay, now that will give us that, force us to select a doctor when we go and create a patient. Just running it one more time. If I go to patients and create, okay, so now down here you see it says select a doctor, and if I click create, right, I get my validation error message. You must select a primary care physician. Where did that come from? Well, it came right from the patient class. That's the error message we gave for the required foreign key integer, right? That's good. And I can pick a doctor and then it goes away. It's happy. There we go. I'm just going to go back to the list, point out that on the edit page, there is no such option, right? We didn't add it because we should only be able to choose a valid doctor, okay? If, on the other hand, it was a nullable foreign key, then we would have to have a separate option up here that they could choose to say no doctor assigned or something like that. But our database design, our model, okay, assumes that no, there is always a doctor is required to be assigned to every patient. So that's why we don't have that option here. And that completes step 2, right? Our UI fixes to our overall application. There we go.